Nothing gets my curiosity revved up more than the subject of John F. Kennedy. From the wealthy Irish Catholic father who had ties with the mob to JFK's assassination in Dealey Plaza, there's so much that we know, and there's so much that remains hidden and untold. Today, I'm bringing on a good friend of mine, Mr. George Trullinger, to discuss all things Kennedy, and a free-form conversation that I think you'll find as entertaining as you will informative. Let's dive in. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for once again joining me right here at the Ryan Files. I got an awesome guest this week, the one and only George Trullinger. You might know him from the day the music didn't die, but George is, like myself, kind of just someone who's a little curious about stuff and has researched stuff over the years. And one of the topics that he's really into is about the Kennedys. Of course, we talk about the Kennedys quite a bit on this particular program. So thought I'd bring George on and let's talk about the Kennedys. How you doing, buddy?
Hey, Ryan, it's great to be on your show. I've been looking at some of the past episodes, including the one we did with Stingray and with Timmy, and you really got a great thing going here.
Oh, you're very kind. Hey, George, so let me just preface a few things. Number one, I've known you for years, and I was talking with my wife, Amy, and she said, you know who you should have on the Ryan Files? And I said, who? And she says, George Trullinger, to talk about the Kennedys. Because apparently she has been around when you have gone into all the details that, just it's kind of been like a little bit of a passion for you, if I'm not mistaken, right?
A little bit. It was one specifically. I mean, I know a bit about the Kennedys, but specifically about the John F. Kennedy's assassination in Dallas and the similarities. I got interested after the Robert Kennedy assassination in 1968, and I was only 8 years old, and the similarities. And I think in that time, it was a turbulent time. The Vietnam War was going on, and I'm not an expert. I want to fully disclaim that I'm not an expert. I'm just a thinking guy. And for whatever reason, if you've ever been in a green room when I'm playing Jeopardy, I have retained an awful lot of trivial knowledge that I can ring up or just happen to know about. We were talking before we went on air about my dad. My dad had this ability he was a celestial navigator, and he had this ability. He knew about trigonometry, and we were little kids, and he taught us before calculators. He taught us how to work a slide rule, and he told us he had a great capability of taking the most complicated subject and breaking it down so that even a kid could understand it. And two things come to mind: the Einstein's theory of relativity and the concept of infinity. And I remember being in about the fifth grade, and the teacher saying, "Can anyone tell me the speed of light?" I would be the only one raising my hand. 186,000 miles per second. Well, yes, that's right. How did you know that? I said, well, my dad told me. And or the theory of relativity, E equals mc square. My dad broke it down into an example you may have heard of before, that if two twin boys were born and one got on a rocket ship and traveled a year at the speed of light, and then came back to Earth, he would be a year old. The kid on the rocket would be a year old, and his twin brother would be an old man. So the relationship between the speed of light and the time and distance and all this stuff. And so I have this mind that retains different things, and I began to notice growing up in Los Angeles, and I think that had a lot to do with it. Where Robert Kennedy was assassinated was the old Ambassador Hotel, which doesn't exist anymore, but it was literally in our city, and he was going to be the next president. It was pretty clear that he was going to be the next president. So after his assassination, there were all of these theories that came up, and of course the theories about JFK never stopped since since 63. And then people started to show the similarities between the two. And I think it really hit a nerve with America that this family, the Kennedy family, who had gone through so much tragedy, including the oldest son, Joseph Kennedy Jr., volunteering for a suicide mission in World War II and never came back. He was actually the one being groomed to be the president before Jack Kennedy. And when he was killed and Jack was on a PT boat because his brother had died, then John F. Kennedy became the one that Joseph Kennedy, who had a colorful background and career, that's the one that he wanted to make president. Yeah. And all three brothers, the surviving brothers, all three ran for president. All three had a pretty good shot, although I think, and obviously JFK won, I think pretty sure that Robert Kennedy would have been elected president. And of course, he was assassinated and never achieved it. So it has been on my mind. And then there's threads. You don't know if Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of the Kennedy clan, his association with the mafia and organized crime in the bootlegging days had anything to do with RFK and JFK. So it's incredible. It's a hell of a story.
Yeah. Well, we're going to dive into it. Right before we do, I do want to ask you something I ask a lot of people that come on the Ryan Files. George, what's your thoughts on aliens? And let me preface this two ways. What's your thoughts on UFOs, first of all, the craft themselves? And if you believe that they are real, then who are the pilots? And if you don't believe that they're real, then there's no need to answer the second question. So let me just ask you, are UFOs real? And if so, who are the pilots?
UFOs, from the technical standpoint, absolutely do exist, because there have been things in the sky that people have not been able to identify, whether it's a bird or a simple airplane or a weather balloon, which is the default in incidents like Roswell. The weather balloon seemed to get a lot of the blame for that. I think, and this does tie back into the assassination or just conspiracy theories in general, I think most thinking people believe that the government isn't always being honest with us.
Shocker.
That they're holding back probably for our own good, or for the sake of harmony, or whatever it is. And I think if it became evident that there were things as aliens from another planet, another world, it would disrupt a lot of things, powerful things, like the Catholic Church, organized religion. It would disprove a lot of things, and it would be very interesting to see what the explanation would be, in the sense that they would want to preserve what they built up for thousands of years. And at the same time, like you, I am a Christian and I'm a man of faith. And as you know, as we go on through life, especially as we get older, that faith is seriously tested. So did it happen? I don't know. I tend to believe that people believe that they saw something. And if it's unexplained, I'm not so anxious. Maybe that's the scientific part of me. You want to explain it. I'm also a bit of one of my first jobs in show business was being a magician. And I know that a lot of magic is based on some principles that deception, hey, look over here while the real magic is going on down here. So I think the government does that. They call it wag the dog. There's a number of terms that people can be familiar with. But I think, and getting back to the JFK and RFK assassinations, I think there's a lot that the government is not telling us. I think there's a lot that the news media is not telling us, whether it's for our own good or the good of the country or however they rationalize it. I, like you, would prefer to know.
National security. That's what it always is. Nowadays,
Yep.
it's national security. Well, let's dive into it. Okay. Let's go wherever you want to start. I know that uh, President Trump in the past said that he was going to release the files, at least about John F. Kennedy. He took a step back from that and said no. And pretty recently he said that he thinks that he's going to do it now in his second term because there were some people alive during his first term that are no longer alive that he didn't want to implicate in any way that had something to do with it. I don't know what that means. I have my own speculation and thoughts, but we might find out a little bit about this, and whether or not what we find out is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth remains to be seen. Not a lot of faith there in terms of information coming from our government, especially when it deals with any of the three-letter agencies. So, but just dive in, man. Get this story going because it's fascinating to me, and it's at a point in time where things really started. It had started before this, in the 40s, really, right after World War II, and during World War II spawned some of this stuff. But man, as we get into the 60s and whatnot, it had time to germinate. And it's when really a lot of things fundamentally changed, in my opinion, in this country. And around it all was the Kennedys.
That's very true. I think to just dive into it, I think the Cold War had an awful lot to do with it. And in 91, I was very fortunate to go with the show Legends over to Russia on a mission of cultural tourism.
Wow.
And it was right after, actually, we were scheduled to go over in the summertime when the weather was very nice. And we were going to do a tour of St. Petersburg, Riga, Latvia, and then wind up in Moscow. We wound up being there for 15 days. Because they had a coup where the military tried to overthrow Boris Yeltsin, and there was actual tank fire fired at the Russian White House. It was postponed until November. And we went in the wintertime. It was quite cold. But one of the things that struck me about meeting the Russian people, and at that time, communism had technically fallen, but people were coming up to us as we were very larger than life figures. I went with Michael Jackson and Paul Revere's wife, Sydney, who did Marilyn Monroe. And I mean, we were just, everywhere we went, were just crowds of people. But people would come up, Ryan, and say in broken English, please tell me how to be free. How to be free. Or they would ask you for things. Before we went over there, there was an American businessman who had brought us over to do these shows. And he said, before you take the trip, there's our friend. Before you take the trip, go to, at the time it was Kmart, go to Kmart and get things like chewing gum and tubes of lipstick or very mundane, what we would consider mundane things, and just tuck them into your luggage. And when you meet people, just hand them out. And I remember being on a bus and talking to one of our interpreters, and her name was Eileen. She was in her 50s, and she was very stout and very Russian, but she spoke very good English. So one day I said to her, hello, Irene, and it was very cold. It was in the 20s, and we were all bundled up, but it was exciting. And one day I said, Irene, how are you doing? She says, oh, Mr. George, not so well. I have a bit of, I've talked too much. I have a bit of a sore throat. And I reached in my pocket and I pulled out some lifesavers. And I said, here, have one of these. And she took it. And I went to the back of the bus And when a few minutes later, she comes back and she says, Mr. George, do you have any more of this medicine? She had never seen lifesaver candy. This is right as the country was opening up. So there were different things. So you got a striking view of the country. I was struck by two things. Other than the language barrier, we were pretty much the same. And their government had kept them in the dark just as much as we were in the dark about their culture and everything. And I think that had a lot to do with it. You remember Khrushchev coming and banging his shoe at the United Nations and not being allowed to go to Disneyland and being all upset about that and making some pretty bold statements about how America would fall from within. Their demise would not come from rockets and soldiers. It would fall from within. And it was very, most people don't know, Kennedy was definitely a Democrat, but he was a capitalist. His father definitely was a capitalist. He was anti-communist, and he was a guy that was trying to lower taxes. And all of these things that you mean, anytime you mention the military, anytime he was very much, even though he's responsible for getting us into the Vietnam War, this term that you hear a lot of in conspiracy theories, the military industrial complex, it's all about money. It's all about power. And my feeling is that he did something or was a threat to someone very, very powerful. And even terms like space race or the arms race were very, not right around the time I was born, people were digging bomb shelters in their backyard because of this Cold War hysteria, this fear that at any minute this mutual destruction could start. And I think that's kind of really the same. In other words, we think we're so sophisticated now and technically advanced, but there's still that fear and people that still remember it. And my dad was in World War II. He remembers the big war, and how powerful that was and what a nuclear bomb absolutely was capable of doing. And right. That's a pretty wild thing to think of. People read about it in history books, but there were people and that remember when it happened. They remember the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and those people are dying off. They remember the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and those people are dying off. And what we have is media and memories, just raw data, like reading out of a history book. And nobody really does that anymore. Right. But I think the struggle, that's my basic sense, regardless of who did it. And that's a wild question too. Who's responsible? That the Warren Commission, their report is flimsy. The whole thing with Oswald, who was a nut, but was a government trained marksman. He was a Marine. You don't get through the Marines not knowing how to shoot. The weapon, the Italian carbine that he literally bought through the mail for less than $20. You're going to do this horrendous thing. Also in research, there's a theory that that JFK was not his first target, which is interesting. This guy knew he was going to kill somebody, but on that day, it was the president of the United States. And if you've ever been to Dealey Plaza, which I've been a couple of times, it seems so small. It seems like such an unlikely location for anything of world importance to have transpired.
Right.
But and of course, the whole thing about Camelot. He was beloved, regardless of your political viewpoint. He was a young man with a beautiful wife and two beautiful little kids. And to make it even sadder, which contributes to the sadness that the Kennedy family had endured, Jackie had a miscarriage while they were in the White House. So you had this young family, and everybody who doesn't remember little John saluting his father's casket at his funeral. Oh, it's just heartbreaking.
Yeah, and then of course the tragedy of how he died.
Oh,
I mean,
again, the
crazy.
Kennedy family touched so many lives, and they were Camelot. They were the hope. And I think for the generation that followed, namely teenagers, the baby boomers, you went from having the youngest president and in a heartbeat wound up with one of the oldest guys to hold the office, Lyndon Johnson. And they didn't like each other. Johnson was on the ticket so that they could win the vote in Texas and similar states. So there was a lot going on. And another thing, Johnson hated the Kennedys because they were Harvard guys and upper crust, and he was an old country boy, Texas rancher, but he despised Bobby Kennedy. Then when you talk about the three-letter organizations, J. Edgar Hoover did not like the Kennedys and had dossiers on them. Now here's a guy, you know, as we all know, maybe some people don't know, maybe I'm going to say what I say and people go, real? Oh, hey, that's bullshit. But he was a cross-dressing, power-hungry megalomaniac. You know, the whole story has not come out on him. There's so many of these subjects that intersect and play off one another. Not to mention the old man's, and we don't even think of it today, but it was a big deal that JFK was the first Roman Catholic elected to the presidency. Joseph P. Kennedy definitely was the powerhouse behind that. Very powerful guy, very rich guy. You've all heard the stories of dead people voting in Chicago and the mob involvement in that. Sam Giancana getting votes, basically helping Kennedy to get elected. And then he appoints his brother Bobby as Attorney General. And the first thing he does is go after the mob, go after Sam Giancana, and go after Hoffa, and go after all the dirty stuff. So I was going to say they should make a movie about it, but they kind of did. You know, several movies have been made sort of about it. So it's this love affair with the Kennedys, this young family, this young man who said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Started the Peace Corps, did a bunch of good. And then it's all taken away. The tragedy, the sadness, the big state funeral. I remember being a little boy. I was 3 years old and asking. Everybody was crying. And I kept asking my mom, and I'd tug at my dad's pant leg, why is everybody so sad? Because I didn't understand what it was. And as I got older, I understood that sadness. And I also remember being in California and the days after, you know, not unlike a lot of tragedies like the space shuttle or 9/11, you go through a couple of days of being glued to your television set.
Yeah, for sure.
And then you're just exhausted. Well, my parents were just exhausted. And I was a little kid, and I was up watching a kid's show, Soupy Sales. They're in Los Angeles. Right. And they broke in, and we had a black and white RCA television. And they broke it. We interrupt this program to bring you a news bulletin. And it was them leading Lee Harvey Oswald through that corridor of the basement of the police station. And on live TV, I watched Jack Ruby shoot Oswald.
You saw that live?
I saw it live, and I ran into my parents' room. I told you in our other podcast, I'm writing a book. That's one of the things that I write about in the book. I ran into my mother and father's bedroom. They were both asleep, and I said, "Mom, they shot the man. They shot the man got shot." And my dad's like, "What are you talking about?" And then they come out in the living room and they discover that that Oswald had been shot. And they didn't know who he was, and there was chaos and all this. It's a fascinating story. The Zapruder film. We talk about technology. The technology at the time, Abraham Zapruder, who was a businessman in Dallas, had a movie camera, silent 16 millimeter camera, and he stood on a little wall. In fact, when I went to Dealey Plaza, I stood in the same spot from the perspective that Zapruder had. And he was actually afraid of heights, and his secretary had a hold of his legs so he wouldn't fall off the little wall. And he's just there taking a home movie of the president driving through Dallas in the motorcade. And that became, nobody knew, he certainly didn't know, that became one of the biggest pieces of evidence that the Warren Commission had to, that was the template that everything that came out of the Warren Commission had to match up with. The magic bullet, the angles, how many shots were fired, what's the distance, how far did the car go, the Secret Service agent jumping on the back when the shots rang out. Governor Conley of Texas was also shot. And I was reading today some research, the magic bullet, they had to account for it. And it went through Kennedy, the back of Kennedy's neck. It went through 15 pieces of fabric before it lodged into Governor Connolly. It's just all this weird, like you can't make this stuff up. Also, the fact that Zapruder immediately had his film developed, I think, at a drugstore or something benign like that. Or maybe I might have that wrong. May have turned it over, but there was an original copy, and people were in the room when they ran it, Secret Service agents and all this stuff, and Zapruder himself, I believe. And they ran it. And I don't exactly know the timeline. He knew he had something, but he didn't want to go to the authorities until he knew what he had. So he had the film developed, and then they watched it. One of the first people to see the unedited version was a cub reporter for Dallas, local TV station, a fella named Dan Rather. Was brand new. And it's amazing how the aftermath of the Warren Commission and everything, how intricate, how key people in the investigation went on to greatness. Gerald Ford, someone from Michigan who nobody ever heard of, was on the Warren Commission and became president after Nixon basically appointed president without an election. Sounds kind of familiar, don't it? Dan Rather went on to take Walter Cronkite's place and Walter Cronkite, you can look that up. You talk about things that make you tear up. His live reporting in black and white on the death of President Kennedy. Oh my God, it put a lump in your throat. And he's trying to be stoic. He's trying to report the news. And it was just this horrible tragedy. We don't know. There's a lot of loose ends out there. Also, a lot of material witnesses that the police, talking JFK, just turned up dead. A lot of the witnesses, people along the parade route, the motorcade route, that had definite angle and had a story that didn't exactly jibe with the Warren Commission's findings, they died. They disappeared. Suicide, accidents. It mathematically doesn't add up. So the elements of a conspiracy were always there. And then when I got old enough, and of course Robert Kennedy, there were inconsistencies with that.
Before we get to Robert Kennedy and move on to the similarities, I guess you would say, I want to get your opinion on something. Obviously, you don't know, I don't know. But if you had to take a guess, given everything, and I think you're right, I think it has something to do with money and power,
Right.
as most things do. Do you have your own personal theories on why Kennedy was killed, and if so, possibly who it was? Anything at all? Any leanings, at least?
I'm sort of divided on that. I think for political power, Johnson was very ambitious. There is a part of me that Johnson's mindset at the time, he wasn't vice presidential material, if you know what I mean. Yeah. He always thought he deserved to be in that driver's seat. And when he finally got there, I believe that's what killed him. He agonized over the Vietnam War. He agonized over everything. And I've heard it said, and I don't know if it's true, but I've heard it said that he could never relax. There was no such thing as a vacation. He was always campaigning, always politicking, always making a deal. And I think there's another phenomenon that anyone can notice throughout history is, for some reason, being president ages you very quickly. You look at what they looked like when they took office, and 4 years later or 8 years later, and it's incredible. I think it's the weight of the world on your shoulders. I also believe, this is my belief, I don't know it to be true. You can make promises on the campaign trail. I'm going to do this. And I think I'm going to do that. I'm going to cut taxes. I'm going to do whatever. I'm going to cut military spending. We're going to get out of whatever country we're occupying. And I think not when they're president-elect. I think that inauguration day, part of that day is when they take the oath of office and become the president, they take them into a room and they tell them the truth.
Here's the real deal.
Here's how it really is. You may think you're the most powerful man in the world. You are not. You promise to cut taxes. Here's why you won't be able to do that. And here's what you're going to tell the American people. You promise to get out of this country or that country, or do this or don't do that. Here's why you're not going to be able to do that. And we've got a whole staff of people. And I think that's why, and when you think about the presidency, everything, they don't even lay out their own, they don't even pick their own socks to wear. Everything is done for them, and yet they are the most stressed, like they have the weight of the world on their shoulders. And I think that has a lot to do with it. I think there are, if you think, I'm not discounting the presidency, but if you think the president of the United States is the most, that is not my belief that the president is the most powerful person in the world.
And I think that, well, world aside, I don't think the president is the most powerful person in our government.
Right. I agree.
I think it's non-elected people that are the most powerful.
Yeah. I really, what did Mark Twain said? If voting really made a difference, they wouldn't let us do it.
Yeah, right.
So there's a number of theories, and I don't mean to be a conspiracy theory. I have friends who are flat earthers. I have an opinion on that. I have friends that don't believe we went to the moon, and that was, again, that was 1968, late 60s, early 70s. That was amazing to me. And we were kids of the space age. Even our toys were rockets, and you'd ask a kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be an astronaut.
Yeah.
Yeah. And living down here in Florida, it happens so often. There was a rocket launch the other night. I remember, Ryan, when we first moved here and the space shuttles were going off, all our whole street would be out watching it, because I'm about 90 miles from the Cape. Now they happen so often, I'm the only one out in the street now watching it. And the drill is, and I think the space program had something to do. You know, JFK said, we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of this decade. And that applied a lot of pressure. There was a lot of money. Is it even feasible? And I think he did something, you know, and then there's another aspect of JFK, which is kind of the Hollywood version. Oh, he was messing around with Marilyn Monroe, and he was playing footsie with the mafia, or he was, you know, the Cuban Missile Crisis, or what, you know, who knows? It's so many factors, and I think the government wants that. When Oliver Stone was making his movie about the assassination, he raised some very interesting points too, but it's all up in the air. And I know RFK Jr. has some definite, certainly about his father. He is in the Kennedy clan, and it's going to be interesting to see how his participation in today's government works out. And when you talk about this subject, you open up a big can of worms.
Yeah, for sure. I've always thought, just in my research, man, you know, it always goes back to money and power, and Occam's razor is, you know, the easiest, you know, most logical, simplest thing is probably what it is. And all this other stuff is just window dressing to get us on different trails. But I've always thought, you think about Vietnam and the amount of money that was made because of that war by the military industrial complex, the CIA, so much of that with Air America and drugs, and just there's so much going on there. I really feel like for lack of a better word, you call it the deep state or the three-letter agencies or whatever. I felt it was one of those moments where they said, this guy's going to win because everyone likes him. And we can't stop that, but we can try to control it. And if it doesn't work the way we want, we've got our guy in to be the successor. And I think that was Johnson. And I do believe that while we had troops in Vietnam, you know, Kennedy had just signed a month before he died, a reduction of 1,000 troops from Vietnam. A lot of people say that he wanted to get out of Vietnam, but did not want to do so before the election for his reelection because he didn't want to look weak on communism. Of course, he signs that to get lower by 1,000 troops, and a month later he's done. And of course, Lyndon Baines Johnson is right there, and within no time you have the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which later on in life, you know, so many people, including Johnson himself, said, yeah, we were probably just shooting at whales. There was no there. So you have this entire war that was generated, developed, started because they wanted it to be started. And you had a guy in power who could influence the public to say, no, let's get out of there. And I think in some way, I'm not sure who it was, but in some way, shape, or form, I think that was probably it. Plus, that in concert with the fact that the Kennedys, it was Camelot, like you said.
Yeah.
It's hard to, you know, destroy Camelot without making a martyr, you know, and yet they did in their own way. By trying to later on, you know, talk about the Marilyn Monroe stuff and all that, you know, destroy your idols, but also by you think about this, um, they did not play ball, so to speak. You know, all the backdoor secrets and whatnot, and the involvement with the government and the mafia and all that stuff that really does take place. You know, you have his brother, the attorney general, going after it, and they just weren't going to play ball. They were going to try to do things the right way. They're trying to be good guys. I think I believe that.
Well,
Not perfect humans.
I was just going to say, for everybody has heard about the sex life of JFK.
Yeah,
a real playboy, a real there is accounts of him the day before his wedding being with someone other than Jackie. So I think, and that's a fascinating thing as well, that still lives on in politics today. If you remember Gary Hart fooling around on a yacht called Monkey Business, ironically enough, there was a time when the press would almost cover.
Don't destroy your heroes.
Yeah.
I mean, if Elvis Presley, was around today, he wouldn't be Elvis Presley, because the press today destroys their heroes, And you see this through sports, you see it through politics, you see it through celebrities all throughout history up until, 80s, 90s, 2000s, really you started getting into it. Yeah.
So there's no way of knowing. Even the death of Marilyn Monroe is shrouded in controversy.
Yeah.
But it goes back to the Kennedys, goes back to even like the Rat Pack. But both, as the story goes, and it's kind of a little bit, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Joseph Kennedy, JFK and RFK's father, in the 1920s was messing around with Gloria Swanson, a big star in silent movies. She one of her big movies was Sunset Boulevard with William Holden, where she played the aging silent film star. But that was his mistress. Rose Kennedy knew about it, but remained very stoic for the sake of the family. And all those kids, they were a big Irish Catholic family, had a lot of kids, and there are a lot of Kennedys running around. But they were both messing with Marilyn Monroe, and Marilyn sort of fell in love with Jack, and Jack sent Bobby to kind of help him break it off, and Bobby wound up having a thing for Marilyn Monroe. So I mean, it's a convoluted thing. Like I say, it's like a Hollywood script. It's like a movie.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, they're human beings.
Right.
They have faults, and they have committed sins, and some have committed atrocities, and you have to be very careful who you pick as your hero, because they've got skeletons in their closets, and sometimes you hear about it, sometimes you don't. But I know RFK Jr. doesn't believe there's some inaccuracies in reporting. There's inaccuracies in evidence. Evidence has just been lost. For example, the FBI totally got rid of any evidence. They interviewed Oswald just a few days before the assassination in Dallas, but there's no record of that. There's accounts of it, but Hoover got rid of all of that stuff. Anything that could implicate the FBI, they just got rid of. And now it's sort of lost to the dust heap of history. It's sort of a dim memory. And like you said, a lot of the cast of characters, I mean, that was 60 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was a long time ago. And we may never know. And supposedly there's documents that have been sealed and won't be made public until, just think about who, they're all gone. Everybody. Now, what's interesting, I found out, and I did not know this as much because like a lot of things, you intensify your interest on it and you learn about it. And then years can go by and you know about it, but you don't really keep up on it. Sirhan went up for his 15th parole hearing and they granted him parole. Were you aware of that?
When?
In 2021.
Really?
They were going to parole him, and in 2022, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, overruled it. Said, no, you won't.
Wow.
One of the few decisions that guy's made that I agree with, but it's interesting. His original sentence, and again, I was down in California during all of this. The RFK, it was a horrible year. Also, there's ties or there's similarities in the assassination of Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
Very, very similar situation. And it's very interesting that Hoover had a dossier on everyone involved in that too.
Yeah, and there's declassified documents where the FBI was sending Martin Luther King letters telling him to kill himself. And I mean, this is all declassified stuff. It's disgusting.
Also, they were figuring out ways. The mafia. This is how the tie-in with the mafia during the Cuban Missile Crisis, or when Castro took power in Cuba. The mafia was in on plans with the FBI and the CIA how to assassinate Castro. They were going to put poison in his toothpaste. They were going to put explosives in his cigars that he famously smoked, and all these different things. Of course, the Bay of Pigs, which was a fiasco, just very incredible. But Sirhan was originally sentenced to death, to die in the gas chamber, and in 1972, California declared the death penalty unconstitutional, and everyone with a death sentence at that time, including the Manson family, were all given life in prison, and that meant that they got a parole hearing every 5 or 7 years. So they were taken off of death row. Our own system. This gets back to what Khrushchev said. We don't have to fire a shot. Yeah. You're going to disintegrate from within, and now, everyone, and there's a case in the news today, the Menendez brothers might be released. Oh, they did this horrible thing. There's not like, gee, we got to find the real killers. No, those two guys did it. They went out and bought sports cars and Rolexes, and they're burning through the money. Then they get thrown in prison. And, well, they've been there for 30 years. They've paid their debt to society. They're going to let them loose. They let some of the Manson family loose. So all of this heinous stuff, I got no answer for that.
Unfortunately, there's been a lot of people let loose of late, but we won't get into that.
But it's all of these different things. And again, here we sit, going to be 2025. You remember when you were a kid and the year 1999 seemed so far down the road? Here we are. It's going to be 2025.
Yeah.
And
and not only that, just I remember in your 20s or even your 30s, and certainly your teens. I remember thinking, 50 years old is, golly, I'm going to be old. Well, in about 14 days, I'm going to be 52. And so it's
don't feel bad. Don't feel bad, youngster.
Oh, you'll get there someday, George.
I'll be 65 this next year.
Hey, all right. 65, baby.
I got to fill out my Medicare paperwork next month.
Yes, you do. And then, and I love getting the AARP stuff in the mail. It's awesome. It's kind of funny.
And how it intersects with my life now, as you know, when we first met, I was doing Buddy Holly, and now my primary gig, although I still do Buddy Holly in this great production called The Day the Music Didn't Die, and I primarily my real job now is I perform as Ed Sullivan in a show called The Fab Four, and that's been such a great thing for me to be at this point in my life and this stage of my career. But that is another theory that I have, and one of the reasons, I guess, why I'm so interested in the Kennedys. That dynamic of going from the youngest president and Camelot to the oldest guy in the good old boy smoke-filled backroom deals. Just a matter of weeks later, that was November 22nd, 1963. February 9th, 1964, the Beatles hit. And it brought the whole country out of this funk. The country was sad. The country was just depressed and sad and in a stage of grief and disbelief. And the Beatles came along and woke up the teenagers and the young generation. And I've done a lot of research on Ed Sullivan as well. He was one of the first to understand that teenagers were a marketable demographic to appeal to. They had disposable cash, and again, those people that knew Ed Sullivan are all dying out. But the comedian Steve Rossi or Little Anthony, he and I were talking about it on one of the oldies cruises we were on. He said the great thing about Ed Sullivan, he said we were on the Chitlin circuit, me and the Imperials. We're playing in places, getting dressed in kitchens. The rats are running across the floor. He said one appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show and we're opening. He says, and he gave the year 64 or 65 or whatever. He said one appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, we have 1 million selling. We have a gold record. Yeah. He said we're getting phone calls to open up, be the opening act at the Riviera Hotel in Las Vegas for $15,000 a week. That was huge, man. You buy a house for $15,000. So he was really, people would say, Ed Sullivan, who walked everywhere, would run into people. And because you're on television, and you get this all the time, people feel like they know you because they've seen the show so many times, or they've seen your podcast, or they've just seen you perform, and you don't really know them. You kind of know them, but they think they know all there is to know about you.
Right.
And Ed Sullivan would gravitate toward the teenager, and he would say, what records are you listening to? What groups do you like? And he would write them on a piece of paper and hand them off to somebody. And that's how many, many people got on the Ed Sullivan Show and just rocketed to stardom and had a career. And that's why I run into a lot of people who will tell me, Robert Klein, Steve Rossi, who was actually on the night. He was with the comedy team of Allen and Rossi, Marty Allen and Steve Rossi. He was on the Ed Sullivan Show the night the Beatles were on. And after that show, offered to take them out on the town, show them around New York. And George Harrison was the only one that took him up on the offer. And he took George Harrison to 21 and to the Peppermint Lounge. And he said that was the last time for many years that George Harrison could go anywhere without a security team, you know. Wow. But it was that assassination in Dealey Plaza in 1963 that sort of set the stage for the Beatles. And that's one of the theories of why Beatlemania became so rampant, was because the country was so depressed and we were just looking for something to snap us out of this misery. And
amen. Yeah, that's interesting.
The Beatles. Yeah,
isn't it interesting how things like if that's why I get so frustrated by actual history not being taught in schools and the revisionist histories and changes in history. I don't care per se how bad it is. In fact, we should be talking about the bad history because the saying is, if you forget your history or you don't remember it, you're going to relive it. And
You're
it's
destined to
cyclical.
repeat it.
Yeah, it's cyclical. And there's so much to be learned. There's more to be learned, I think, in the bad history than there is in the good history in some ways. Lessons are there,
My father said it to us in a different way. He said, the past, knowledge of the past can be your crystal ball to the future.
Yeah.
If you want to know what's going to happen, look at what's transpired, look at what's already happened and connect the dots.
Amen, man. Well, George, listen, I don't want to run too long, but we haven't quite finished this topic. So I'm going to ask, man, if you would mind, can you come back maybe here? Maybe
I would love to. There's 143 different topics that I would love to cover. And we'll do it in 3 or 4 episodes, Ryan, I promise.
I love your mind, man, because it's all interconnected, and I love your flow of thought. Because it is all interconnected, and I do that a little bit too much, I know, but I'm tracking with you. I get it, but we're gonna come back and talk more about the aftermath of JFK and then what happened with the rest of the Kennedys, because that's fascinating as well.
Anytime. All you need to do is drop me a message, and I also do a show. It's not at this level and technically advanced, but I do it on Facebook when I'm all made up as Ed Sullivan, and it's called Backstage with George. And I just do a selfie, and wherever we are, whatever city we were in. We were just in Jacksonville, Florida, at the Florida Theater, and that has an Elvis connection. I was thinking of you and a lot of my friends who do the King of Rock and Roll. That was. And it's hard to believe now with what you see on TV and how tame everything was in the past. But Elvis was not. They were going to close his show down. They weren't going to let him perform at the Florida Theater because his act was obscene. He was indecent, and that was the city where Elvis did his show in the chamber of a judge. And the judge said, there's nothing wrong with this guy, and let him perform. And that was at the Florida Theater in Jacksonville.
That's awesome.
So it goes, and the same with the Beatles. People were shocked at how long their hair was, And you look at it now and you think, God, those guys were babies. And their hair wasn't that long. My gosh, go to Walmart sometime. Holy Moses. Holy God. You see some things there that just make you, oh my God.
Go to Walmart. You'll always feel better.
Oh my gosh. It's unbelievable. In fact, that's where I'm going. As soon as we get finished here, I'm going to Walmart. Boy, I'm going to put on my what the heck goggles.
You walk out of there feeling like $1 million.
Oh my God. I really am a good looking guy.
Oh, George, you're incredible. I love you so much. We're going to get George back, but man, thank you so much for coming on this week. And I'll be in touch with you. We'll continue this, and can't say thank you enough. You're awesome. Ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Ryan. Yep. Hey, happy New Year to you and Amy. And I wish you nothing but continued success and nothing but the best. And I wish that to everyone who tunes into this podcast. Here's to all the better days.
Right back at you, brother. I love you, man. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. The one and only George Trullinger. George is awesome, and I love talking to him. He's an endless fountain of knowledge, and we'll have to have him back because there's even more to the Kennedy story than we covered today. Thanks for tuning in this week to the Ryan Files. If you enjoyed today's deep dive into the Kennedys, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. Your support spreads the word and keeps this mission alive. And if you're ready to take it to the next level, visit theryanfiles.com and click on Become an Agent. You'll find our Patreon there with multiple tiers of support and exclusive content just for you. Your contributions are what keep these investigations going, and I can't thank you enough for being part of this amazing journey. You folks are awesome. Stay kind, stay positive, and stay curious out there. And I'll see you right here next week on the Ryan Files.
Are you not curious?
Preparing to transfer the Ryan Files. Now.
I present to you, with great intrigue and wonder, the Ryan Files.